Orlando is a city defined by its brilliance under the sun, yet its quiet streets hold the echoes of every scream that fell into the night. From a man slumped against a hammer-stained wall to an old veteran fallen on a cracked sidewalk, from a reporter's blood smeared across a camera lens to a driver's lifeless hand still gripping the wheel as a single bullet froze time at a green light. Each scene left behind a heavy silence. While the verdicts may take years to arrive, no courtroom can restore the lives stolen. Behind every sentence handed down, there's a heartbeat that never got to finish its story. This is inside Orlando's most notorious killers, shocking murders, and true crime cases. Welcome back to Murderium, where real crimes meet real justice. Case 1. Jose Rafael Cantero. Orlando is a city of warmth and welcome. A city built on the promise of escape, from the ordinary, from the difficult, from the weight of everyday life. Millions pass through its streets every year, chasing something lighter, something bright. The city has made an industry of wonder, of spectacle, of the belief that magic is always just around the next corner. But Orlando has another story, one that does not appear on any tourist map. And Jose Rafael Cantero is part of that story. What happened in 2024 was not the product of a sophisticated criminal operation. It was not the result of long-running gang conflict or organized crime moving through the city's underbelly. It was something in many ways more disturbing because it was intimate, because it was close, because it happened with the kind of weapon that exists in almost every home in America: a hammer. The deliberate use of a hammer as a murder weapon speaks to a particular kind of violence. This is not the detached, impersonal act of shooting from a distance. This is violence that requires proximity, commitment, a willingness to be present with what you are doing in a way that firearms do not demand. Investigators who work these cases understand this distinction, and it changes the way they read a crime scene. What Cantero carried out was a double homicide. 2 lives taken. 2 families permanently altered. 2 human beings who woke up on what should have been an ordinary day in 2024 and did not make it to the next one. The details of what led to that moment, the relationship between Cantero and his victims, the circumstances that placed them together on that day, form the architecture of a case that Orlando investigators had to dismantle carefully and completely. Because in a double homicide, the prosecution must account for everything. Physical evidence in a case like this one is rarely subtle. A hammer leaves behind a particular kind of evidence, the kind that forensic investigators document with precision and that prosecutors present to juries with deliberate impact. There is no sanitizing what happened to Cantero's victims, and the courtroom did not attempt to. What the investigation revealed was a picture of a man willing to use extreme, direct violence to achieve an end, whatever that end was. And in 2024, Orlando found itself adding another name to the registry of cases that remind its residents that the brightness the city projects to the world does not reach every corner of it. Cantero was arrested. The case against him was built on the physical evidence the scene had preserved, on the investigative work of Orlando law enforcement, and on the testimony that placed the events of that day in undeniable sequence. 2 victims, 1 perpetrator, and a city left once again to confront the violence that lives just beneath its surface. In the courtroom, the hammer was more than a weapon. It was a statement about what Jose Rafael Cantero had been willing to do, and how close he had been willing to get to do it. Orlando does not forget its dead easily. In the case of a double homicide carried out with that level of personal, deliberate force, the city's justice system made certain that forgetting was not an option. The verdict delivered accountability. The sentence delivered consequence. And 2 families, forever changed by what happened in 2024, received the only thing the law could offer them in return for what they lost: justice. Late, insufficient, and absolutely necessary. Case 2. Charlie James Hall. Some cases close quickly. The evidence is present, the suspect is identified, and the machinery of justice moves at the pace the public expects, measured in weeks or months, not years. These are the cases that appear in the news cycle and fade just as quickly, resolved before they have time to settle into the city's memory. And then there are cases like Charlie James Hall, cases that do not close, that sit open for years, then decades, accumulating the particular weight of unresolved violence while the families of victims grow older, waiting for answers that never seem to arrive. Cases that begin to feel, after enough time has passed, like they may simply never be solved. Charlie James Hall's case rewrote that assumption in 2022, and it did so with 4 letters that have transformed criminal justice in the modern era. DNA. The murders Hall would eventually be connected to dated back to 1987. Let that number sit for a moment. 1987. A year when the investigative tools available to law enforcement were a fraction of what they are today. When crime scenes were processed with methods that have since been revolutionized. When biological evidence could be collected and preserved but not yet read with the specificity that modern forensic science makes routine. In 1987, Charlie James Hall may have believed, perhaps with reasonable confidence, that whatever he left behind at those crime scenes would never be enough to find him. That time, if nothing else, would work in his favor. He was wrong, because somewhere in the evidence collected at those cold case scenes, biological material had been preserved, stored, waiting with the patience that only evidence can have, unaware of the passage of time, indifferent to the decades accumulating around it, ready to speak the moment science had developed the language to listen. In 2022, that moment arrived. DNA technology, applied to evidence that had been sitting in storage since the late 1980s, produced a profile. And that profile, run through the databases that modern law enforcement maintains, produced a name. Charlie James Hall. For the investigators who worked Orlando's cold case unit, moments like this one carry a particular emotional weight. Cold cases are not simply old cases. They are open wounds for the victims' families who have carried grief without resolution for years, and for the investigators who inherited files thick with questions and thin on answers. For Hall, 2022 represented the arrival of a reckoning that must have seemed, for decades, safely out of reach. Whatever life he had constructed in the years since 1987, whatever distance he had placed between himself and those murders, collapsed the moment that DNA match was confirmed. In the courtroom, the DNA evidence anchored the prosecution's case with the kind of certainty that witnesses fade and memories erode, but biology does not. Hall's own genetic material, left at the scenes of murders committed when Ronald Reagan was president, spoke across 35 years to place him at the center of crimes Orlando had never stopped pursuing. The victims of those 1987 murders had waited 35 years for a courtroom to speak their names in the context of justice rather than tragedy. That possibility became reality. Orlando's cold case files are not empty gestures. They are active commitments to victims, to families, and to the principle that the passage of time does not extinguish the obligation to pursue justice. Charlie James Hall learned this in 2022. 35 years after the murders, long after he may have convinced himself that the city had moved on. Orlando had not moved on. It had simply been waiting for science to catch up with what justice had always demanded. Case 3. Gerodourism. There are cases that challenge even the most experienced investigators. Cases that require a particular kind of professional resolve, the ability to process evidence methodically, to document facts precisely, and to carry the weight of what has been uncovered without allowing it to break the people whose job it is to pursue justice on behalf of those who can no longer speak for themselves. The case of gerodourism in 2024 is one of those cases. Because the victim was a child, there is no framework that makes what happened easier to approach. There is no professional distance sufficient to fully insulate the people who worked this case from what the evidence revealed. And there is no way to present the facts of what Dourism did without confronting directly the reality that a child, a human being at the very beginning of life, entirely dependent on the adults around them for protection, was failed in the most catastrophic way imaginable. Gerodourism was arrested in 2024 for the murder and sexual assault of a child. Both words in that charge carry equal devastation. Together, They describe an act so fundamentally contrary to every obligation society places on adults that the criminal justice system reserves its most serious response for exactly this category of crime. The investigation moved carefully, deliberately, because in cases involving child victims, the evidence must be gathered and documented with a precision that leaves no procedural gap for the defense to exploit. Every detail matters. Every piece of physical evidence, every forensic finding, every element of the timeline must be assembled with the understanding that what is being built is not just a legal case. It is the only remaining voice a child victim has in a courtroom. Investigators became that voice. Dorism's arrest brought him before a justice system that has, over decades of confronting crimes against children, developed both the legal framework and the prosecutorial determination to ensure that cases like this one are not minimized. In the courtroom, the evidence was presented with the thoroughness that the charge required. Forensic testimony, physical evidence, the documented timeline of events that placed Dorism at the center of both crimes, the assault and the murder, beyond the threshold of reasonable doubt. The community of Orlando, upon learning the details of what had happened, responded with the particular fury that crimes against children reliably produce. Because the murder of a child does not stay within the boundaries of a legal case that contains it. It radiates outward, into schools, into homes, into the conversations parents have with their children about a world that sometimes fails to protect them. Orlando parents held their children a little closer in the days following Dorism's arrest. Jerry Dorism faced the full weight of what Orlando's justice system brings to bear on crimes against children. The charges against him reflected the totality of what he had done. Not one crime, but two, layered in a way that the law recognizes and responds to with maximum severity. The child deserved a full life. What the justice system could offer instead was the certainty that the man who took that life would not simply walk back into the world and continue living his. Case 4. Keith Melvin Moses. January 2023. Orlando, a neighborhood going about the unremarkable business of an ordinary afternoon. People inside their homes. A street that looked from any distance like any other street in any other part of the city. Nothing announcing itself. Nothing signaling that what was about to happen would reach beyond the neighborhood, beyond the city, and into a national conversation about violence, about journalism, and about the randomness with which tragedy selects its victims. Keith Melvin Moses changed all of that in a matter of minutes. What he carried out on that January afternoon was a mass shooting. But within the category of mass shootings, the Moses case carried details that distinguished it in ways that the country felt acutely. He killed a woman. He killed a child. And he killed a news reporter who had responded to the scene to cover what was already, before her arrival, a story of devastating loss. 3 victims, 3 separate moments of irreversible consequence, all produced by one man with a firearm on a January afternoon in Orlando. The woman died first. The details of her death, the circumstances that placed her in Moses' path, the complete absence of any justification for what he did, represent the foundation of a case that was already, before the other victims fell, a story of senseless, unforgivable violence. Then the child. If the murder of an adult civilian carries a particular weight in the conscience of a community, the murder of a child carries something heavier still. When a child is shot and killed in a neighborhood on an ordinary afternoon, something shifts in the community that witnessed it. A threshold is crossed that cannot be uncrossed. Moses crossed it, and then, as law enforcement responded and media followed, as the machinery of reporting that exists to document tragedy and inform the public moved toward the scene, a journalist arrived to do her job. Daima Loving was a television news reporter. She was there because that is what reporters do when violence erupts in a community. They go toward it, equipped with cameras and credentials and the professional commitment to bear witness on behalf of the public that needs to know. Daima Loving did not go home from that assignment. Her death transformed the Moses case from a local tragedy into a nationally reported story. News organizations across the country covered the case with the particular intensity that journalism brings to threats against journalists. Her name was spoken on broadcasts from coast to coast. Orlando law enforcement had Moses in custody quickly. The shooting had not been concealed. Moses was apprehended in the immediate aftermath, and the investigation that followed had the benefit of evidence that was fresh, witnesses that were present, and a crime scene thoroughly documented. The charges against Moses reflected the full scope of what he had done. Multiple counts of murder. The prosecution's case, built on physical evidence, witness accounts, and the documentary record that a crime of this visibility inevitably produces, moved toward trial carrying the weight of 3 lives and the attention of a watching nation. What the law could establish was this. Keith Melvin Moses killed 3 people in Orlando in January 2023. He killed them without justification. And in the case of Dima Loving, he killed someone who had come to bear witness to the violence he had already committed. Orlando has not forgotten any of them. The woman, the child, the reporter who went toward the story and did not come back from it. Keith Melvin Moses will spend the rest of his life answering for what he did on that January afternoon. 3 names, 3 families, 1 verdict that could never be large enough to match the loss. But the only one justice had to offer, and Orlando made certain he faced it. Case 5, Lamar Antonio Bryant. Marriage is built on trust, on the quiet, daily decision to place your life alongside another person's, to share mornings and evenings, to build something together that neither could construct alone. It is, at its foundation, an act of profound vulnerability. You let someone in. You give them access to the innermost architecture of your existence. You trust them with the version of yourself that the rest of the world never sees. For Lamar Antonio Bryant's wife, that trust became the thing that made her most vulnerable. And in 2025, it cost her everything. Bryant was charged with the premeditated murder of his wife. Not a crime of passion, not a moment of rage that spiraled beyond intention. The word premeditated carries specific legal weight. It means planning. It means forethought. It means that at some point before the act itself, a decision was made. Premeditation changes everything about how a case is prosecuted and how a jury receives it, because it removes the one narrative thread that defense attorneys in domestic homicide cases most frequently reach for, the argument that something happened in the heat of a moment. Premeditation forecloses that argument entirely. It says, plainly and without ambiguity, that this was chosen. Investigators in 2025 pieced together the evidence that supported that charge. In domestic homicide cases, the investigation almost always moves backward before it moves forward, tracing the relationship, the patterns within it, the communications between the parties in the days and weeks preceding the death. Text messages, phone records, financial records, the statements of people who knew the couple. All of it becomes material. All of it becomes part of the picture that prosecutors must assemble to demonstrate not just that a death occurred, but that it was planned. His wife had not simply died. She had been killed by the person who had stood beside her and made a promise. The kind of promise that is spoken in front of witnesses, recorded in documents, and understood by everyone present to represent the most fundamental commitment one human being can make to another. He broke that promise in the most irreversible way possible. Her family grieved not just her death, but the betrayal that preceded it. The knowledge that the danger had been closest to home, that the threat had shared her address, her table, her life. In the courtroom, the premeditation charge anchored everything. The prosecution built its case on the evidence of planning, the deliberate sequence of decisions that led to her death, and on the physical and forensic evidence that documented what had been done. Orlando in 2025 was confronted once again with a truth that no city ever fully absorbs, that the most dangerous place for a person is sometimes not the street, but the home, the private space, the place that is supposed to be the safest address in a person's life. For Bryant's wife, home was where the danger lived. She deserved the safety that a marriage is supposed to represent. She deserved to grow old. Lamar Antonio Bryant made certain none of that happened. And in 2025, Orlando's justice system made certain he answered for it. He had planned it, and the law, in recognizing that planning, ensured that his future reflected the full weight of what he had taken from her. A wife, a life, a future that belonged entirely to her, gone by the hand of the person who had promised to protect them. Case 6. Samuel Stevens. There is a particular kind of rage that a community feels when the victim is someone who served. Someone who put on a uniform, raised their right hand, and made a commitment to something larger than themselves, to the country, to the principles it represents, to the millions of people living lives made safer by the willingness of a small percentage to stand between them and the threats that would otherwise reach them directly. In 2023, Samuel Stevens shot a United States Army veteran in Orlando. The victim had survived whatever the military had asked of him. He had navigated the particular dangers that service demands. He had come home. He had made it back to the ordinary world, to the streets of Orlando, to a life that was supposed to be safer than the one he had left behind in service. And then Samuel Stevens shot him. The investigation that followed moved with the urgency that the shooting of a veteran in a civilian setting demands. Law enforcement assembled the timeline, the circumstances of the encounter, the sequence of events that placed Stevens and the victim in the same space at the same moment. The decision that Stevens made to use a firearm against a man who had already given more to his community than most people are ever asked to give. But communities do not process loss in purely legal terms. And the community of Orlando, which houses a significant military and veteran population, processed the shooting of one of its veterans with a grief that carried the additional weight of what the victim represented. He had survived service. He had come home, and Orlando had failed to keep him safe. That failure was not the city's alone. It was Samuel Stevens, entirely and specifically Stevens, whose decision to shoot produced a consequence that the victim had no reasonable expectation of encountering on an ordinary day in 2023. The investigation placed Stevens squarely in the frame of the evidence. The charges brought against him reflected the seriousness of what had been done, the shooting of a man whose life had already been defined by sacrifice. Orlando's law enforcement built the case methodically. Witness accounts, physical evidence, the forensic documentation of a shooting that left no meaningful ambiguity about what had happened or who was responsible. Stevens was arrested. The case against him moved forward with the weight of evidence and the particular community investment that comes when the victim is a veteran. The military community of Orlando rallied around the case. Veterans organizations, active service members, families with loved ones deployed or recently returned. All of them watched the proceedings with the particular investment of people who understood personally what the victim's service had meant. The veteran had earned his place in civilian life. Samuel Stevens had no right to take it from him. And Orlando made certain that the courtroom said so. Case 7. Nicholas Carrasquillo. The road is supposed to be neutral ground, a shared space governed by rules that every licensed driver agrees to follow. Rules designed not as bureaucratic formality, but as the practical architecture of safety for the millions of people who occupy highways and streets simultaneously every single day. The understanding is simple and fundamental. We move through this space together, and in doing so, we extend to every other driver a basic, unspoken agreement. We will not harm each other. Nicholas Carrasquillo broke that agreement in 2024, and he broke it with a weapon. Road rage incidents exist on a spectrum. At one end, the horn pressed too long, the gesture made in frustration, the exchange of words through rolled-down windows that dissipates as quickly as it ignites. At the other end of that spectrum is what Nicholas Carrasquillo did, a deadly road rage shooting, not an escalation that surprised even its own participants. A shooting, the deliberate deployment of a firearm in a traffic dispute, the transformation of a shared public road into a killing ground. What makes the Carrasquillo case carry an additional layer of weight is a detail that sits alongside the facts of the shooting itself. Nicholas Carrasquillo was a military veteran, a man who had been trained by the United States military, trained in the use of weapons, trained in the discipline that the armed forces instill, trained in the understanding that force is a tool of absolute last resort. That training did not prevent what happened in 2024. The victim of Carrasquillo's road rage shooting did not survive the encounter. A life ended on an Orlando road in 2024 because of a dispute between drivers, the specifics of which, whatever they were, could never be sufficient justification for the use of lethal force. Carrasquillo did not allow the ordinary course of events to unfold. He reached for a weapon. Orlando law enforcement responded to a shooting scene on a public road in 2024 and began the investigation that would ultimately place Carrasquillo's conviction in the record of the city's criminal history. The investigation assembled what road-based incidents typically produce in abundance: surveillance footage from traffic cameras, dashcam recordings, witness accounts from other drivers who had observed the confrontation unfolding. The evidence constructed a timeline: a confrontation between vehicles, an escalation, a decision, the specific deliberate decision to use a firearm that converted a traffic dispute into a homicide. In the courtroom, the prosecution addressed not just the shooting itself, but the circumstances that surrounded it. The absence of any threat sufficient to justify lethal force. The presence of a loaded firearm in the vehicle of a man engaged in a road confrontation. And the choice, clear, documented, and fatal, to use that firearm against another driver who had done nothing that warranted dying for it. He shot and killed another person on a public road in Orlando over a traffic dispute. The conviction that followed was the justice system's answer to those facts. A person driving on an Orlando road in 2024 had a reasonable expectation of arriving at their destination. Nicholas Carrasquillo denied them that expectation permanently. Justice, in 2024, caught up with him at the end of a road he should never have taken. Case 8. Tommy Lee Legree Jr. Youth is supposed to be a story of beginning, of the long, unfolding process of becoming, the gradual accumulation of experience, judgment, and understanding that transforms a child into an adult capable of navigating the world with the wisdom that only time and consequence can build. We extend to young people a particular kind of grace, an understanding that they are unfinished. The law reflects this understanding. Juvenile systems exist precisely because society has decided, through long deliberation, that young people who commit crimes deserve a different framework, one that accounts for age, for development, for the incomplete nature of a mind still in the process of forming itself. Tommy Lee Legree Jr. was charged as an adult. That decision, the decision to move a teenager out of the juvenile system and into the full weight of adult criminal prosecution, is never made lightly. It is a legal determination that the nature of the crime, the circumstances surrounding it, and a specific profile of the individual defendant place the case beyond the framework that youth-oriented justice is designed to handle. In 2025, Tommy Lee Legree Jr. found himself on the wrong side of that determination. The shooting that brought Legree before Orlando's adult criminal justice system carried the weight that all shootings carry: the immediate, irreversible consequence of a trigger pulled, a projectile released, a life altered in a fraction of a second. This was not the impulsive, poorly considered act of a young person overwhelmed by a moment they lacked the tools to navigate differently. The circumstances surrounding the 2025 shooting pointed towards something more deliberate, more considered, the kind of decision-making that the adult system is designed to confront. For the community of Orlando, the case of Tommy Lee Legree Jr. raised the questions that every juvenile charged as an adult raises. Questions about where responsibility begins, about what systems failed before the shooting occurred, about what path led a teenager to a moment serious enough to place him before an adult court in 2025. None of those answers arrived in the courtroom with Legree. What arrived was the evidence of what he had done, the documentation of a 2025 shooting. The testimony and physical record assembled by Orlando investigators who had approached the case with the same methodical thoroughness they bring to every shooting, regardless of the age of the person responsible. He stood there as a teenager, charged with what adults are charged with, facing what adults face. For the victim of the 2025 shooting, the age of the person who pulled the trigger had no bearing on the consequence of the act. A bullet does not calibrate its damage based on the age of the person who fired it. The harm done is identical. The loss produced is the same. The decision to charge Legree as an adult was the system's recognition of that reality. Its acknowledgement that the severity of what had occurred demanded a response proportional to the act rather than to the age of the actor. There are no easy conclusions in a case like this one. There is only the evidence, the charge, the courtroom, and the recognition that in 2025, Tommy Lee Legree Jr. made a decision that collapsed every version of his future into the single, narrow corridor that the adult criminal justice system defines. The victim deserved better. The community deserved better. And somewhere in the distance between the teenager Tommy Lee Legree Jr. once was and the defendant he became in 2025 lies the question that Orlando, like every city confronted with youth violence, has not yet found a complete answer to. How do we reach them before the courtroom does? Until that answer arrives, the justice system will continue doing the only thing it knows how to do when prevention has failed. Hold them accountable, fully, formally, and with the weight that the law reserves for those whose actions, regardless of age, demand it.